Have you ever held something so ordinary, a tin, a cup, a worn-out scarf, and felt the weight of an entire life pressing gently in your hands? Some objects don't speak loudly. They whisper, they hum with memory. They wait patiently, year after year, in quiet corners of quiet homes, holding on to the warmth of people who once held them too. Tonight, we visit one such place. A quiet farmhouse nestled in a valley where time moves a little slower, where the fireplace no longer burns, but still remembers, and on its mantel a simple button tin rests, filled with small keepsakes and stories too soft to shout, but too meaningful to be forgotten. As we begin, let the hush of the countryside settle around you like an old quilt. Let the rhythm of this gentle story rock you slowly toward rest, and when you're ready, we'll open the lid of the button tin together and see what stories have been waiting there all along. There is a house at the end of the lane, not the kind that calls for attention, not the kind painted bright or trimmed in neat white fences. It simply stands there, a little back from the gravel road, its shingles weathered, its porch boards slightly bowed, as if the house itself had learned over many years to exhale slowly. It was built of hand-cut timber by someone whose name no longer passes between mouths, but whose presence lingers in the way the back door creaks open on a rainy day, or in the odd angle of the pantry shelves that somehow fit the old canning jars just right. The chimney leans a little, but it still stands. The garden out back has grown wild, but in a way that doesn't feel abandoned, just gently retired. Goldenrod claims the edges, and wild mint has slipped between the rows where tomatoes once grew. There's a peach tree too, bent and spotted with lichen, but it still gives fruit, soft and small like offerings. Inside, the air smells of cedar, cinnamon, and something older than both. Not musty, not stale, just time-worn, like a favorite book that's been read too often to close cleanly. The light in the kitchen is soft and golden, filtered through curtains made from old linen, stitched by a hand that once knew the rhythm of quiet afternoons and careful hems. The clock on the wall ticks with a steady kindness, not loud, not urgent, just present, and there, above the fireplace, sits the button tin. It isn't fancy. The lid is a faded blue, the kind of blue you'd find in a summer sky just before dusk. There's a dent on the side, and a faint rust ring where someone once set a mug on top of it, perhaps during a long winter's evening beside the fire. The paint has worn away in places, revealing the silver belly of the metal beneath, but even now it shines, just a little, when the morning light slants through the windows at the right angle. No one lives in the house full time anymore, but it hasn't been forgotten. Grace, who grew up within these walls and raised her own children here, returns from time to time, on quiet weekends in early autumn, or whenever the noise of the world grows too loud to bear. She never says that's why she comes. She just drives in, parks beneath the walnut tree out front, and lets the hush of the place fold around her like the arms of someone who knows you well. She doesn't stay long, a day, maybe two. She'll dust off the table, warm up the kettle on the old stove, sit on the back steps with a cup of tea and watch the clouds drift over the hills. Sometimes she'll hum an old hymn or speak aloud to no one in particular, to the memory of her husband Tom, to the garden, to the wind. There is comfort in speaking to things that don't interrupt, and always, before she leaves, she opens the button tin. The tin has never held just buttons. Over the years, it became something else, a gathering place, a small archive of quiet importance. Inside are ribbons and ticket stubs, a safety pin bent just so, a note written in pencil on the back of a seed packet, a fragment of her child's first drawing, a thimble that once belonged to her grandmother, a stone from the river behind the orchard. None of it would mean much to someone else, but to Grace, each item has weight, not physical, but emotional, like a breath held in memory, like the way a voice stays with you long after it's gone. She doesn't open the tin quickly. She lifts the lid the way you would turn the first page of a sacred book. Her fingers know where each item rests. She doesn't need to look, but she always does, just to be sure that time hasn't taken something away when she wasn't watching. She doesn't cry. There's no grand swell of emotion, only the kind of quiet aching that lives beneath gratitude, a soft reminder that to have loved so deeply means you've carried something of worth, even now. The tin is like the house, simple, sturdy, and full of history pressed into its corners. It doesn't tell its stories all at once. It waits until you're still enough to hear them. Outside, the wind begins to shift, not a storm, just a signal that evening is coming. The trees on the far hill lean slightly with it, their leaves brushing against one another with the sound of old paper. The sky takes on that first tint of lavender, and the swallows wheel lower across the field. Grace closes the tin, not with finality, but with the kind of care one uses to tuck a child into bed. She places it back on the mantel exactly where it belongs. Then she walks to the porch, pulls the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and watches the sun melt into the fields. There is no music here, no distractions, only the long hush of twilight and the steady thrum of a place that has never stopped holding space for those who need rest. And now, if you're ready, we'll stay a little longer, not to hurry the story forward, but to dwell in it, to let it unfold slowly, like the way lavender blooms in the corner of an old garden, quietly, faithfully, whether someone notices or not. Morning comes slowly in places like this. There's no sudden burst of sunlight, no alarm clock buzzing through thin walls, no hum of passing cars or delivery trucks braking at the curb. Instead, light begins as a whisper, a faint easing of shadow on the old floorboards, a soft silver rising behind the trees. The first to notice it is not Grace, but the kitchen window. Its thin glass, a little fogged from the breath of the night, begins to catch the faintest glimmer of day. Behind the curtain, a silhouette shifts, leaves moving gently outside, like hands waving through sleep. Inside the house, everything remains still. The braided rug by the door holds the memory of footfalls. The kettle on the stove waits, its metal cold but not forgotten. Even the air seems to hold itself in place, as if honoring the hush before the world remembers itself. Grace wakes not with a jolt, but with a sigh. Her eyes open slowly, already knowing what they'll see. The familiar beams of the ceiling, the pale curtain that dances slightly in the breeze from the cracked window, the outline of the rocking chair where Tom used to sit reading before breakfast. She doesn't rise immediately. There's no need. The house does not ask anything of her. It receives her exactly as she is, quiet, worn at the edges, and still tethered to sleep by a few delicate threads. Eventually, she does sit up, swinging her legs over the edge of the old wooden bed, whose frame creaks in greeting. She presses her feet into the worn slippers by the rug, a ritual so familiar it has become a kind of prayer. Outside, a wren calls, softly, then again, as if to say, there's no rush. The morning is here, and it has time. The kitchen greets her as it always does, No surprises, no grand gestures, just a gentle welcome of worn wood, a chair pulled slightly askew from yesterday's tea, a teacup left upside down to dry on the towel beside the sink. She moves slowly, not from pain but from reverence, the kind of movement that comes only when one learns there is beauty in doing things with care. She fills the kettle with well water, watching the thin stream curl and ripple, catching the light as if it were made of glass. She sets it on the stovetop and waits, listening to the ticking of the wall clock and the faint stirring of breeze in the poplars outside. While the water warms, Grace opens the back door. It sticks a little, always has. A firm push, a low creak, and then the world beyond opens to her. The garden is awake in its own way. Dew sparkles on the grass like 1,000 quiet stars, and the leaves on the peach tree glisten, heavy with last night's rain. A rabbit startles near the woodpile but does not run far. It pauses, nose twitching, before hopping slowly back beneath the lilac bushes. The stone path beneath her slippers is uneven, laid by her father's hands when she was a girl. Some of the flat stones are chipped, some have shifted slightly over the years, off-center, to the bench beneath the old sycamore. She sits there now, cupping a mug of tea, warm and fragrant with a pinch of mint pulled from the edge of the porch. The bench moans a little under her weight, but not in protest, more like greeting. It remembers her, it remembers Tom, it remembers their laughter and the silence that followed when he was gone, but it does not mourn. The garden does not know sorrow the way people do. It only continues, growing, resting, reaching, always generous with what it has. A squirrel chitters from the crook of a maple. The wind gathers its breath and drifts through the goldenrod, nudging petals like a friend brushing hair from your face. Grace closes her eyes. She lets the warmth of the tea seep into her palms, lets the sounds of morning drift over her. This is the kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything. It doesn't try to fill the space, it simply waits. And in that waiting, it offers comfort. She remembers the mornings when the children were small, bare feet running across the wood floor, toast forgotten in the toaster, milk spilled and wiped quickly with the corner of an apron. The garden was less wild then. Tom would water the beans early, whistling some old tune she never learned the name of. He'd bend to pull a weed, then pause, resting his hand on the small of his back and scanning the sky like it was speaking to him. He always believed the weather spoke first through the trees. If the sycamore leans early, he used to say, there's a storm coming from the west. She smiled at the memory. That tree had leaned a little every morning, whether storms came or not. Now she leans too, just slightly. Time does that to you, but she is not brittle, not broken, just softened, like the edges of the garden stones, like the inside of her teacup, rimmed with use and warmth. She finishes the tea slowly. There's no need to rush, no errands, no meetings, no calendar pages to flip. The day will be what it is, and that is enough. When she stands, she moves back along the path, pausing once to kneel by the herbs. Her knees creak, but her hands still know what to do. Plucking a stem of rosemary, pressing it to her nose, and breathing in the sharp, steady green of it. Inside, the house waits, its door left ajar, and on the mantel, the button tin waits too. Perhaps today she will open it again. Perhaps she will run her fingers over the folded note Tom left for her one winter, his handwriting faint but unmistakable. Or maybe she'll just sit beside it a while, letting it rest in its quiet place, trusting that not all remembering must be done aloud. Some days are meant for words, some are meant for silence, and some, like this one, are best held gently, as you would hold a warm cup in both hands, not to drink right away, but simply to feel that something is near and that it is enough. By mid-afternoon, the weather had turned, not in a way that called for concern, but with that familiar shift that comes in late summer. When the air grows still, the birds quiet down, and the trees begin to hold their breath. Grace was in the kitchen when the first drops began. She heard them before she saw them. Tiny taps on the window pane, like someone softly knocking from the outside. She paused at the sink, hands still damp from washing the breakfast cup, and turned toward the sound. Rain, she always thought, had its own kind of memory. It didn't just fall, it returned. To roofs it had once visited, to soil it had softened before, to windows where it had once traced the slow journey of thought across a quiet afternoon. Outside, the fields darkened slightly as the clouds thickened overhead. The peach tree bowed deeper under the weight of the coming shower, and the birds, sensing what was near, found refuge beneath the porch eaves. Grace dried her hands, set the cup back into the cupboard, and crossed the room to the rocking chair by the hearth. She didn't need a fire, it was still warm enough, but she pulled the old shawl over her shoulders and let her body settle into the familiar sway of the chair. It creaked in all the same places. The rhythm was known to her body, a gentle forward and back like the breathing of something older than comfort, older even than grief. She listened for a while, to the rain, to the silence it carried with it. There are silences that feel empty, hollowed out, echoing, and then there are silences like this one, soft and padded, like a blanket laid across a sleeping child. It was in this kind of quiet that Grace often remembered Tom most clearly, not with tears or longing, but with that deep-set warmth that rises from below the ache, like sunlight filtered through old lace curtains. Her eyes drifted, as they always did, to the mantel. The button tin sat quietly, unchanged. It never called attention to itself. It just waited. She rose, slow and steady, and crossed the room to lift it. The metal was cool in her hands, even with the warmth of the day. She carried it to the small table beside the chair, settled back into her seat, and opened the lid. Inside, the contents were just as she'd left them. A delicate mess of memory. She didn't rush. Her fingers moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with reverence. Each object was a door, and some doors, she had learned, are best opened gently. There, near the bottom, tucked between an old patch from Tom's work shirt and a photo of their daughter at age 7, was the letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and the folds had grown soft and rounded from handling, but the writing, though faint, was still there. Tom's hand, neat and deliberate, the kind of script that came from years of addressing envelopes with care and always signing his name the same way, as though he believed in the steadiness of lines. Grace unfolded it slowly. She didn't need to read it. She already knew every word, but sometimes she did anyway, just to feel the shape of his thoughts under her eyes again. He had written it on a rainy day, much like this one. She remembered the smell of the kitchen that morning, freshly baked bread cooling on the counter, a faint trace of lavender from the linen drawer, and the scent of rain on gravel wafting in through the open window. She had gone into town for supplies, and when she returned, the letter was waiting for her on the table beneath a smooth river stone to keep it from blowing away. It wasn't a long letter, just a few paragraphs, but it was the kind of letter you carry with you, Even when your hands are empty. He'd written about the way the fields looked just before the rain, how the wheat shimmered as if it remembered something, how the barn swallows had dipped lower in the sky. He'd mentioned the way the sycamore leaned again, and how he knew she'd laugh when he said so. Then, at the end, he wrote something she had never forgotten. I hope one day, when the house is quiet again, you'll sit by this window and remember that even on rainy days, you were my sunlight. Grace read those lines again now, slowly, like prayer. The words settled into her, not as sadness, but as presence. She folded the letter once more, placed it back in the tin, and closed the lid. The rain thickened for a while, playing a steady rhythm against the metal roof. It lulled the world into a soft hum. No harsh edges, no urgency. Grace returned the tin to the mantel, then lit a candle on the table. The flame was small but steady, casting a gentle light that flickered across the wooden walls, as though the house itself were breathing along with her. She didn't speak. There was no need. Some stories don't need retelling. They live in the creak of a floorboard, in the way the wind lifts the corner of a curtain, in the scent of rosemary still lingering on her hands. She sat until the candle burned low. The rain eased into a whisper, and the light outside turned to the soft gray of approaching dusk. Evening would come, as it always did, slow and unassuming, and Grace would welcome it, not with ceremony, but with quiet presence, just as Tom once did, just as the garden still does, just as the button tin has always done, holding, remembering, waiting. It was just after the rain had passed, when the light returned in that soft, washed kind of way, clean and open, like the first page of a letter you forgot you'd written. The gravel in the driveway was still wet when Grace heard the car. It came slowly, respectfully, as if it, too, understood that this place asked for gentleness. The tires crackled over the stones, and then a soft click as the engine stopped. She was still in the kitchen, drying the last of the teacups when the door opened. "Grandma?" The voice was light, young but steady, like a stream finding its way over old stones. Grace smiled to herself. May. She hadn't known her granddaughter was coming today, but then again, May had always known when to appear. Not because she had been told, but because she listened for things people didn't say. Grace walked slowly to the doorway, and there she was. Rain boots splattered with mud, a red knit hat pulled slightly askew, eyes bright as wet berries. "I brought apples," May said, holding up a canvas bag with both hands, as if it were an offering to an altar. Grace chuckled. "You always do." They didn't rush to unpack. The ritual of arrival was slower here. First, there was the warming up of the kettle, then the setting of the small table by the window. 2 mugs, a plate of oatmeal cookies pulled from the tin that always sat behind the flour canister, and a folded napkin for each of them, soft from many washings. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way people do when there is nothing to catch up on, because nothing has really been lost in the spaces between visits. May looked around the room, eyes moving over the same corners she'd seen since she was small. The braided rug, the curtain that never quite closed, the clock that ticked like a heartbeat heard through wool. Then her gaze landed on the mantel. "The tin is still there." Grace followed her eyes. "Yes, it never leaves. Do you still open it?" "Sometimes," Grace said, her voice soft, "when the day feels right." May didn't press. She just nodded, sipping from her mug, fingers wrapped tightly around the warmth. After tea, they walked out to the porch. The sky had turned that late afternoon blue-gray that only seems to come after rain, like the world had been rinsed clean and now wore its truest shade. The wooden steps were still damp, but they sat anyway, each tucking their feet beneath them. The apple tree near the edge of the garden had begun to drop fruit. Some lay bruised in the grass, but others clung to the branches, round and red, shaped by wind and time. May pointed. I remember climbing that tree. You were 7, Grace said, smiling, and you insisted you'd seen a squirrel's nest near the top. I did see it. You also fell. Only a little, May laughed, and you gave me pie to make it better. That pie has been a cure for many things. As the light shifted, they walked to the orchard, their boots leaving prints in the damp earth. The trees whispered above them, just enough breeze to set the leaves dancing in place. May paused beneath the largest tree, her fingers brushing against its bark. Does it ever feel like they're still here? She asked, not looking at Grace. Grace took a breath. All the time. She didn't ask who May meant. She didn't need to. This house had held many people. Some had gone to other places, some simply gone, but none had truly left. They live in the way the floor creaks, Grace said softly, in the smell of rosemary when you brush the doorway, in the way the gate swings even when there's no wind. May nodded, her voice quiet. I liked that. They stood for a while longer, watching a single apple fall. It landed without sound. Back inside, the house welcomed them again. It had cooled slightly. That gentle chill that asks for socks and another layer. Grace lit a small fire in the hearth, not for heat really, but for company. May curled up on the couch, a blanket around her shoulders. She looked toward the mantel again. Do you think I could see it? Grace hesitated only for a moment. Then she stood, walked to the tin, and brought it carefully to the coffee table. She placed it between them like a sacred thing. May reached out but stopped. She looked at Grace. May I? Grace nodded. You may. The lid came off with a soft sound, metal against metal, familiar and clean. Inside, the items lay as they always had, a quiet museum of moments. May reached in, lifting the old photo of her mother as a child, then the pressed clover leaf, brown and brittle but still shaped like hope, a spool of thread, a tiny seashell, a folded napkin with handwriting so faint it looked like breath, then the letter. May touched it, then looked at Grace. Is this his? Grace nodded again. May didn't open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she held it gently in her palm, as if feeling the weight of words without needing their sound. After a moment, she placed it back, settling the items as they were, closing the tin with the care of someone placing a child to sleep. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the evening began to stretch its limbs. I think I'd understand now, May said. Grace didn't ask what she meant. She only smiled and reached for her granddaughter's hand. They sat like that for a long time, saying little, watching the flames curl and shift in the hearth. Time passed, the light dimmed, and somewhere in the old orchard, an owl stirred in the branches. This is how memory works. Not with noise, not with urgency, but with presence, in a tin on a mantel, in a story passed from one hand to another, in the silence shared between two people who understand that love lingers, not in what we say, but in what we keep, in what we're willing to open when the time is right. Evening doesn't fall all at once in the countryside. It drifts in slowly, like a familiar coat being shrugged over the shoulders of the land. Light softens first. Edges blur, colors deepen. Then comes the quiet. Not an absence of sound, but a hush that feels as though the world has lowered its voice out of respect for something sacred. Grace stood at the kitchen window, watching the last of the day slip across the fields. The garden looked different at dusk, softer. The beanstalks curled inwards, the marigolds closed their faces, and the long shadows from the orchard stretched out like tired arms. The porch light flickered once, then came on. Not bright, just enough to gather the dusk into something warm. The same bulb Tom had hung years ago still worked, though it sometimes needed a tap from her hand to wake it properly. She left the window and stepped out onto the porch. The wood was warm underfoot from the afternoon sun, but already cooling, as if preparing for rest. She pulled the woven shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat down in the rocking chair closest to the light. May had gone upstairs to read, leaving behind the scent of apples and the faint echo of laughter on the stairs. Grace could still hear the soft turning of pages above, a comfort in the same way that birdsong is, familiar, natural, nothing forced. Out on the porch, the world slowed further. The trees no longer rustled. They listened. The breeze had quieted, and even the crickets had not yet found their rhythm. The rocking chair moved gently beneath her, each creak a punctuation mark in the stillness. She didn't think of anything in particular. Instead, she let her mind do what it wanted. Wander, pause, revisit. She thought of the porch itself. How many nights they had sat here, her and Tom, feet tucked under them, passing a tin of peppermint candies between them. He had always chosen the broken ones first. "Less to chew," he used to say, grinning like it was a grand act of selflessness. She never corrected him. The chair beside her, his old seat, sat empty now, but not cold. She still glanced toward it sometimes, half expecting him to be there, half knowing he never truly left. The light above them cast a gentle amber across the railing, illuminating the chipped white paint and the ivy that had begun to climb again this year. Tom used to trim it back every spring, but she had let it grow lately. There was comfort in seeing things reach for something. Down in the yard, the last of the light gathered at the base of the sycamore. It was always the last tree to release the day, as if reluctant to say goodbye. Grace watched a rabbit hop slowly from the edge of the garden, nose twitching, ears high. It stopped near the steps, not startled, just curious. For a moment, they looked at one another. Then it turned and disappeared beneath the hydrangeas. The world in that moment felt entirely at peace. No urgency, no obligation, just being. She reached beside her, lifting the old mug of tea she'd brought out earlier. It was cold now, but she held it anyway. Not for the drink, but for the memory of warmth it once carried. Inside, the house was beginning its own evening rhythm. The kettle had long cooled, the room settling into their stillness. A book lay open on the couch, a blanket half draped over its arm. Every object in the house seemed to breathe slower now. The clock ticked more thoughtfully. The floorboards no longer stretched, but sighed. This was the hour she loved most. Not quite night, not quite day, the in-between, where memory felt closest and time moved like a river at its widest. Slow, reflective, shimmering. Sometimes Grace imagined this porch was a kind of threshold, and not just between inside and outside, but between what was and what had been, between the living and the remembering, between now and the vastness that gently held it. She thought of May upstairs, reading beneath the slanted ceiling of the old guest room. She hoped the young girl would remember this visit, not as something remarkable, but as something still. Stillness was a kind of inheritance too, perhaps the most lasting kind. She hoped she would remember the way the porch light glowed, not bright, but enough. The way the wood smelled of rain and old stories. The way silence had wrapped around them without asking for anything back. As the last birds returned to the trees, Grace rocked once more in her chair and looked out toward the darkening garden. She didn't need to name her thoughts. They were like old friends now, companions that came and went without knocking, that stayed just long enough to be felt, and then dissolved into the evening air like breath on glass. She sat there until the light from the porch bulb was the only glow left in the yard. Then slowly, gently, she rose, the chair stilled behind her. She gave the light bulb its usual tap, just for old time's sake, and it flickered once more before settling into a warm, steady shine. Inside, the house waited. The button tin still sat on the mantel, quiet and sure of its place. It did not need to be opened tonight. Some memories, like some lights, shine just by being near. When morning returned, it did so without announcement. There was no bright burst of sunlight, no dramatic parting of clouds, only the soft gray of a world that had been rinsed and wrung out, hung gently across the fields like a damp cotton sheet. Grace woke to the sound of drops slipping from the roof. Not the hurried rhythm of last night's downpour, but the patient tapping of leftovers, as if the rain, having done its work, was now only tidying up. She stretched slowly beneath the quilt, her joints waking with the stiffness of a well-used gait. There was no rush. The house wouldn't mind waiting, and neither would the day. Upstairs, May was still asleep, or perhaps not, but still in bed at least. Grace didn't call out. Let her stay in that pocket of warmth a little longer. There is something sacred about mornings after rain, something in the way the air feels fuller, in the way the silence returns with more weight than usual, as though the land, too, has just woken from a deep, uninterrupted sleep. She wrapped herself in her cardigan, the one with the loose button and the scent of wood smoke woven into its sleeves, and stepped into the kitchen. The light through the east window was soft, not golden yet, but on its way. The kettle sat where she'd left it, and the matches lay in their usual place beside the stove. She lit the flame, noting how it flared, then settled, just as everything else seemed to be doing today. Outside, a wren hopped along the porch railing, tilting its head at nothing in particular. The world was drying slowly. Puddles had formed in the low spots beneath the clothesline, and the grass shimmered with dew that caught the light in a way only rain-washed blades can. Grace poured water into the kettle and listened to the slow rise of its voice. That soft, steady hiss, like an old friend whispering secrets only you can understand. She took her tea to the back door, eased it open, and stepped out onto the stoop. The air met her like an embrace, cool, damp, but not heavy. It smelled of earth and stone and something faintly sweet. Perhaps the wild mint, perhaps the soaked bark of the sycamore, perhaps just memory. The path through the garden was slick in places, but she walked it anyway, slippers brushing against worm-cast dirt and broken leaves. She stopped at the bench beneath the arbor, where water still clung in perfect droplets along the iron rails. Sitting down slowly, Grace wrapped both hands around her mug and looked out at the field beyond. The land had darkened overnight. The soil deepened in color, the greens more vivid. Everything looked in its own quiet way, renewed. She stayed there a while, not thinking about anything in particular, but letting the day speak first. It said very little, but it said it kindly. A squirrel darted along the fence post, pausing to scratch behind its ear with a quick flick of motion, then vanished into the low branches of the peach tree. The clouds above had begun to shift, making way for light that pressed in gently, like a child knocking at the screen door just to say hello. Grace sipped her tea. It was warm now, but not hot. The kind of temperature that invited slow drinking, the kind that didn't mind being forgotten for a few moments while you watched a butterfly land or a breeze catch the corner of your shawl. She thought of Tom again, as she often did when the world was damp and still. He had always liked days like this, days when you couldn't mow the grass, couldn't paint the shed, couldn't rush through the list of chores because the earth had given you a reason to rest. Let the land breathe, he would say, tipping his hat back as he stood on the porch and looked out at the rows of beans with a kind of reverence. May had that same instinct, Grace realized, the same way of watching things, not with eyes searching for meaning, but with a kind of quiet agreement, as though she understood that meaning would come if given enough time and stillness. Grace finished her tea and stood again, careful not to disturb the puddle gathered at the edge of the bench. She walked slowly back to the house, noticing the way the porch steps creaked just slightly more when wet, how the screen door's handle felt cooler beneath her hand. Inside, the warmth of the kitchen welcomed her, not in temperature, but in familiarity. The way the table stood exactly where it always had, the way the chair tucked itself in like a polite guest. She placed the empty mug beside the sink and looked once more toward the mantel. The button tin sat quietly, as always, not needing to be touched but known. She thought of opening it again, not for the letter, not for the objects inside, but for the act itself, the way her hands moved with memory, the way time slowed around that small ritual. But then she heard soft footsteps on the stairs. May. And so Grace turned, not away from the past, but toward the present. The light through the kitchen window was warmer now. The rain had gone. The house was stirring, and that was enough. The sun had found its place in the afternoon sky, not high and bright as in summer's peak, but mellow, softened by the dampness of the morning and the long shadows cast by the orchard trees. Grace had just finished folding the kitchen towels when May appeared barefoot at the edge of the hallway, hair still damp from her slow bath, face touched by that kind of quiet only children know how to carry after a long, uninterrupted morning. "Can we go pick apples now?" she asked, as if the orchard hadn't already been calling to them for hours. Grace didn't answer right away. She looked outside first, at the way the branches swayed gently, at the filtered sunlight that dappled across the path like lace. Then she nodded. "I suppose it's time." They gathered a basket each, one old and sturdy with a handle wrapped in twine, the other smaller, its weave loose in places but still good for a child's hands. Grace tied on her sun hat, the same one she'd worn for years, faded and soft at the brim. May slipped into her canvas shoes and followed without a word. The orchard was only a short walk from the porch, but they took it slowly. There was no need to rush. Every few steps May would pause, to pick up a leaf, to watch a line of ants, to tilt her head at the soft murmuring of a mourning dove in the distance. The air still held the scent of rain, but now it was warmed, lifted from the soil in small invisible spirals, like steam rising from bread just pulled from the oven. The peach trees stood first, tired from the season but generous still, their limbs heavy with what fruit remained. They walked past them with a gentle greeting, a hand across the bark, a quiet, "You did well this year." Farther in, the apple trees welcomed them. Some stood tall and straight, others leaned, shaped by wind and weather, in the memory of many harvests. "This one's my favorite," May said, placing her hand on a tree with bark that peeled like old paint. It had a low, thick branch that curved like a cradle, perfect for sitting, even better for reaching. Grace smiled. "It was your mother's favorite too." They worked without speaking much, not out of distance, but because there was no need to fill the space. The sounds of baskets filling, apples plucked with a small twist and drop, leaves rustling underfoot. These were conversation enough. Occasionally, May would hold up a particularly round or spotted apple, offering it to Grace with both hands as if presenting treasure. Each one was accepted with the same quiet appreciation. A nod, a smile, a shared memory of sweetness yet to be tasted. The sun moved above them, casting shadows that stretched and softened. Birdsong returned in slow intervals, and bees moved lazily between the goldenrods at the orchard's edge. At one point, Grace sat beneath a tree, her back resting against the warm bark. May joined her, placing her half-filled basket beside them. They didn't speak at first. Grace pulled a cloth from her pocket, wrapped it around 2 apples, and handed one to May. The first bite was crisp, the second, slower. They chewed thoughtfully, as if each bite carried with it something more than flavor, a reminder of every harvest that came before. "Did Mom really climb this tree?" May asked. Grace chuckled. "She did. Fell out of it too." May's eyes widened. "She was fine," Grace added, "just a bruised knee and a new respect for branches." They both smiled. The tree above them stood quietly, unapologetic in its height and angles, bearing witness to every child who had tested their weight on its limbs. Grace looked around the orchard. Some trees had begun to bend permanently. Some bore fewer apples now, and a few in the far corner had gone quiet, no longer fruiting, but still standing, offering shade and memory. "That one never gives apples anymore," May said, pointing. "No," Grace agreed, "but it still matters." "Why?" Grace thought for a moment. "Because it remembers, because it holds space, because it's here." May seemed to understand. She leaned against her grandmother's shoulder and let her eyes wander across the branches. Later they rose again, their legs slower now, but their baskets heavier. They made their way back through the orchard, the sun now slanting low, touching every apple with a honeyed light. At the edge of the garden, they paused. The house sat ahead of them, quiet as ever, its porch bathed in gold, its windows reflecting the field's last glow. Grace looked at May. "You know," she said, "when you're older and this place changes, if the orchard grows wild, if the porch boards creak a little louder, you'll still have this day." May looked up at her, curious. "Where will it be?" Grace touched her chest, then gently tapped May's. "Right here, not just in memory, but in the way you'll walk through the world, in the way you'll slow down when you don't have to." They climbed the steps to the porch, baskets resting on their hips, arms slightly tired, but hearts full. Inside, the kitchen welcomed them with its familiar stillness. The button tin remained on the mantel, watching as it always did. They didn't open it that evening. There had been enough remembering for one day. Instead, they placed the baskets on the counter, sorted the apples one by one, and began slicing a few for pie. The peels curled like ribbons on the cutting board, and the cinnamon filled the air with warmth even before the oven was lit. They didn't speak much, just shared glances, smiles, and the kind of quiet that feels more like music than any song ever written. Outside, the light faded, the trees settled into shadow, and in the small, warm kitchen, two people stood side by side, gathering, preparing, preserving not just fruit, but a season, a moment, a rhythm of belonging. Evening had drawn itself fully around the house by the time the pie was ready. The sky beyond the kitchen window had turned a muted blue-gray, the kind that seems to fold over the fields like a wool blanket, thick, soft, and edged in gold, where the sun lingered just a little longer behind the hills. Inside, the scent of baked apples and cinnamon filled the air, not in a way that overwhelmed, but the way a favorite memory returns. Faint at first, then unmistakably warm. Grace pulled the pie from the oven with careful hands. The crust was golden and uneven, just the way she liked it. Not perfect, but honest. May hovered nearby, bouncing lightly on the balls of her feet, her eyes following every move as if the baking itself were a kind of ceremony, which, in this house, it was. "Do we wait for it to cool?" she asked. Grace raised an eyebrow with mock seriousness. "We should." May smiled. Should wasn't quite the same as must. They sat at the kitchen table, two slices on the old flowered plates that had seen more birthdays, holidays, and quiet nights than either of them could count. Grace poured 2 glasses of milk, cold from the cellar, still in the bottle with the paper top, and they ate slowly. The pie was tart and sweet, soft inside, crisp on the edges. Each bite tasted like September, like trees just beginning to turn, like something ending, but something else beginning too. They didn't talk much while they ate. Sometimes, even with loved ones, it's enough to share space, to hear the clink of a fork, the sound of someone you care for chewing gently across the table. That, too, is conversation. When they finished, May helped carry the dishes to the sink. Grace ran warm water, added a few drops of lemon soap, and they stood together, side by side, washing and drying with the same rhythm, passed down from mother to daughter, from granddaughter to grandmother. Some routines don't need explaining. They are remembered in the hands. Later upstairs, May climbed into the old brass bed that had belonged to her mother. The quilt was already turned down, the pillow fluffed, and on the small table beside it sat a lamp with a cream-colored shade and a clock that ticked so softly it could almost be mistaken for a sigh. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her knees creaking slightly as she settled. The quilt was a patchwork of many years, scraps from dresses, aprons, shirts too worn to mend but too full of memory to throw away. Each square held a story, and May knew that. "Tell me one," she whispered, running her fingers along the faded pink fabric near her knees. Grace smiled. "That one," she said, "was from a dress your mother wore the first time she danced in the kitchen." "She danced?" "Oh yes," Grace said, leaning back a little. "She was maybe 6. There was a storm outside, and the power had gone out, so I lit every candle I could find, and Tom, well, he pulled the radio into the kitchen, battery powered. He turned it up just enough so we could hear, and the music filled the room like magic." May listened, eyes wide. "Your mother stood right in the middle of the floor, wearing that pink dress, and began to twirl. No shoes, just socks sliding on wood. She spun and spun, laughing the whole time, and Tom clapped his hands in time with the beat. We danced with her eventually, but for the longest while, we just watched. She was joy, pure and bright, like a candle you don't want to blow out." May ran her fingers across the square again. She never told me that story. Some stories wait, Grace said. They know when it's time. She tucked the quilt around May's shoulders, pulling it close under her chin. Do you remember the one with the little yellow duck? May asked, pointing to a faded square in the corner. I do, Grace chuckled. That was from your baby blanket. You carried it everywhere for the longest time, until it nearly fell apart. I saved the strongest piece and stitched it right there. May nodded, her voice already drifting toward sleep. I'm glad you did. Grace brushed a curl from the girl's forehead. The lamp cast a soft golden pool of light between them, not quite bright enough to read by, but enough to hold the room gently in its arms. Downstairs, the house had gone quiet. The kind of stillness that settles like flour in a mixing bowl, soft, suspended, complete. May blinked slowly. Will you stay until I fall asleep? Of course. And so Grace sat, not because the girl needed her, not exactly, but because she knew how much it meant to know someone is there when your eyes finally close. She watched as May's breathing slowed, as her grip on the quilt loosened, as her mouth turned slightly up in the shadow of a smile. The wind moved gently outside the window, rustling the maple leaves in low conversation. The air held the last of the pie's sweetness and the faint scent of soap and drying hair. Grace sat a while longer until the lamp cast more shadow than light, until the ticking clock seemed to keep time with the hush of breath. Then, gently, she stood, pressed a kiss to the top of May's head, and turned off the lamp. In the hallway, she paused. The stairs creaked just once as she descended. The kitchen was dark now, except for the glow of the porch light spilling in through the back door's small window. She walked past the hearth, past the rocking chair, and placed a hand lightly on the button tin. She didn't open it, just touched the lid, a small gesture, like a nod, like a thank you. Then she sat, wrapped herself in the blanket that lived draped across the couch, and let the quiet rise around her again. The day was done, not closed but held, like a letter folded gently and placed somewhere safe. And somewhere upstairs, beneath the soft weight of a quilt full of stories, May dreamed of music and candles, and pink fabric spinning on wood. The next morning rose not in gold, but in pearl. The sky was thick with clouds that held no threat, only a softness that diffused the sunlight into something more tender, a kind of glow that made the world look quieter than it was, as if it were being seen through linen. Grace was already awake before the light made it past the treetops, not from habit, but from the kind of gentle rest that naturally comes to an end when the mind has wandered far enough into peace and slowly finds its way back again. She sat on the edge of the bed, her feet tucked into her old house shoes, the kind with the worn leather and stitched soles that had molded to her steps like a second memory beneath her skin. Down the hallway, the house was still. May had not stirred yet, and Grace, in no hurry, made her way down the staircase, one hand trailing the polished rail with the reverence of someone greeting something faithful. The kitchen was wrapped in that early kind of stillness that doesn't need to be protected. It simply is. On the table, the quilted placemats waited as they always did. She laid the kettle on the stove, struck a match, and watched the blue flicker catch the ring of gas with a soft bloom. While the water heated, she walked toward the fireplace, her fingers brushing over the wood mantel that had caught the dust of 100 sunrises. She let her hand pause over the button tin, not yet. Instead, she turned toward the cupboard beside the stairs. A narrow little thing tucked behind the pantry, more shadow than space, more scent than storage. She hadn't opened it in some time. Inside were bundles of old letters, ribbons tied gently but firmly, as if someone had wanted him to stay close but knew better than to tie them too tight. Grace reached for a smaller stack, wrapped in pale blue ribbon, faded to a color almost indistinguishable from memory. She brought them to the table, placed them near the window where the light was strongest, and sat down with her tea. The letters were from a quieter season of life, not from Tom, but from herself, written years ago and never sent, never meant to be, really. Some people kept journals. Grace had written letters to her children, to friends long gone, to God, sometimes to no one in particular. They weren't dramatic. They didn't ask for much. They simply named things, moments, feelings, the way the wind sounded in the barn on a certain October evening, the way her hands ached with the changing seasons. One letter in particular caught her eye. It wasn't dated, but she remembered it instantly. The envelope was unsealed, the paper slightly yellowed along the folds, the ink a little smudged from the time she'd read it by lamplight in the garden during a spring rain. She opened it slowly, as if not to disturb its rest. This morning, I watched the field turn silver under the fog. It didn't rise so much as settle, like a hand coming down over the land to say hush. Grace smiled. She had forgotten that line, and yet it had lived somewhere in her, as most things do. The letter went on. I miss your voice, not the sound of it really, but the way it made space for silence to feel less alone. I miss the way you'd say, we'll figure it out, as if life were always something that could be understood with time and pie and patience. Grace folded it back, pressing it between her hands, not to hide it away, but to feel its shape again. The house around her was quiet still, but not the kind of quiet that waits. This was the kind of quiet that holds. She rose, walked the letter back to the cupboard, and tucked it into the same stack, wrapping the ribbon back with practiced care. When she turned, the sun had begun to press more firmly through the window. Its light touched the kitchen counter, kissed the wooden table, and glowed along the edge of the button tin like a promise not yet spoken. She walked over, lifted the tin, and brought it to the table with her second cup of tea. Inside, the familiar weight of memory sat in its usual places. A dried flower, a safety pin bent into a hook, the thimble, the small shell from a childhood trip to the coast, and near the bottom, a folded slip of paper that had worn thin at the edges. She hadn't opened this one in a while. It wasn't from Tom, nor from her own pen. It was a note written by their daughter when she was maybe 10. Scrawled in pencil, letters slightly crooked, words crammed into the lines of a recipe card. I love this place. When I grow up, I want to live here with you forever and make apple pie every week. Grace read it once, then again. Then she placed it gently on the table beside her mug and sat with it, not as a possession, but as a companion. Upstairs, she heard the sound of May waking. A floorboard shifting, a creak near the window. She smiled. Time, it seemed, had a way of coming around gently. The past didn't knock hard. It tapped at the window in morning light, waited patiently by the mantel, breathed between sips of tea. Some days it brought letters, other days it brought footsteps on the stairs. Grace gathered the note, returned it to the tin, and closed the lid slowly, as if tucking a story back into a drawer where it would rest, but never be forgotten. She stood and turned toward the sound of the morning, the scent of toast, the echo of young feet entering the kitchen, and the light behind her lingered on the mantel, on the tin, on the letter tucked beneath its contents. A soft, steady presence, just like the woman who carried it all. The morning of departure always arrives softer than expected. It doesn't knock, doesn't clear its throat, doesn't drag its heels. It comes like the mist, present before you realize it, settling over porch rails and orchard leaves as if to say, "You've had enough time now, just enough." Grace stood at the kitchen sink, hands wrapped gently around a tea towel, drying the last of the breakfast dishes. The kettle had long gone quiet, its heat fading, but its warmth still clinging to the corners of the room. On the table, in the fabric of the chair cushions and the small porcelain plate, where May's last piece of toast had left a trace of jam. She didn't glance at the clock. There was no need. Time, this morning, was not a thing to be counted, but something to be cradled. Upstairs, she could hear May moving slowly. The quiet zip of a suitcase, the thump of something placed deliberately on the floor, the gentle padding of feet across the old braided rug. There was no hurry in those sounds, just care, just presence. Outside, the world mirrored their mood. The clouds hung low, but without threat. The sky wasn't gray out of sadness, but out of tenderness, as if it, too, understood what it meant to let go without letting everything fall. Grace wiped her hands and turned toward the mantel. The button tin sat as it always had, unmoved but not untouched. She walked over, traced one finger along its lid, and thought of opening it one last time this visit, but she didn't. Some stories had already been told, some memories had been passed, and some could wait for the next season to be opened again. Instead, she pulled a piece of parchment from the drawer by the pantry and wrote a short note in her looping, steady script. "For a day when you feel far away, just open the lid, I'll be there. Love, Grandma." She folded it twice, placed it at the back of the tin, and closed the lid with a soft press. A gesture that felt more like prayer than routine. By the time May entered the kitchen, the scent of fresh bread hung in the air. Grace had been up early, kneading quietly in the half-dark, letting the dough rise while the world still held its breath. On the counter, a small loaf cooled on a rack. Beside it, a bundle wrapped in cloth. Apple slices from the orchard, still crisp and tart, with just a touch of cinnamon tucked into the fold. May stepped into the room without words. Her hair was pulled back loosely, cheeks still flushed from sleep, eyes searching not for anything in particular, but for the rhythm of the room she knew would change again too soon. Grace smiled gently and gestured to the bread. "For the road?" May nodded. "Thank you." There was nothing ceremonial in the moment, just kindness wrapped in flannel, warmed by memory. The porch was damp again, but the sky had begun to clear near the edges. They stood there a while, watching the light return in patches, not sudden, but quiet, like an old friend walking slowly up the hill. The field shimmered with leftover dew, and a bird called once from the fence post, then went still. May looked out at the orchard. "I think the tree with the low branch will still be there next time." "It will," Grace said. "They tend to stay put." They both laughed, just once, soft, like leaves brushing each other in a breeze. Then came the hug, not rushed, not tight, but full, a holding more than an embrace. When they pulled back, Grace reached into her apron pocket and handed May a small item wrapped in muslin. "For your room," she said. Inside, May would find a single button, mother of pearl or with a crack down the center. the one Grace had never quite managed to sew back on because it had long ago become a piece of something larger than its purpose. May held it carefully, as if it might hum with stories. She didn't ask what it meant. She just nodded. They didn't walk to the car right away. Instead, they sat once more on the porch steps, the suitcase resting behind them, forgotten for a few more minutes. Grace reached down and picked a sprig of rosemary from the pot beside the railing. She rolled it gently between her fingers, then handed it to May, who brought it to her nose. "It smells like you," she whispered. Grace smiled, but didn't speak. Some compliments carry a weight so deep, they don't need answering. Eventually, the engine started. The gravel crunched. The mailbox disappeared behind the bend in the lane, and Grace stood alone on the porch, watching the empty space where presence had been. But she didn't feel empty. She felt full of apples and warmth and the quiet knowing that love doesn't leave with the car. It stays in rooms, in corners, in the pages of letters tucked into forgotten drawers, in a button placed gently in a granddaughter's hand. She turned, stepped back into the house and walked to the mantel. The button tin was still there, and beside it a small folded square of muslin and a note, written in child's handwriting, "For when you need to remember." Grace placed her hand over it, then sat in the rocking chair near the window. The morning light had begun to fill the room again, slow and golden. It reached across the wood floor, curled along the hem of her skirt, and warmed the place where memory lives. Not in the past, but in the care we take to carry it forward. After a house has been full, even briefly, its silence sounds different once it's empty again. Not lonely, just deeper, as if the walls have widened slightly to hold what was spoken, and now they hum with the memory of it, softly. Grace noticed it first in the way the spoon rested on the counter, clean, but still damp from its morning rinse. It had stirred one mug of tea instead of two. She noticed it in the upstairs hallway, where the air held the faint scent of lavender shampoo and young skin, the kind of smell that lingers only in quiet spaces long after feet have gone. And she noticed it in her own pace, a little slower, not from weight but from gentleness, a kind of letting go without losing anything at all. The morning after May left was gray again, but not heavy. It was the kind of overcast that made the light inside the house feel closer, more certain, like it knew how to wait. Grace made her tea slowly. She didn't hum, didn't fill the air with anything unnecessary. Instead, she moved with a reverence earned only by years, knowing how small things matter most when the world is quiet. She set her cup on the table, chose the wooden chair with the smoothest armrest, and opened the kitchen window just a little. Outside, the wind was gentle, carrying the smell of earth and the sharpness of green things. The garden, left alone for the past few days, had begun to shift. The marigolds had drooped just slightly, the thyme had crept farther out of its patch, and the beans, resilient as ever, had begun to climb in a new direction, toward the old fence, as if searching for something steady. Grace smiled. The world kept moving, but not in a way that asked you to chase it. It moved like a river in the morning, slow, sure, willing to wait for whoever walked beside it. She spent the rest of the morning in the garden, not tending so much as visiting. She touched the soil with her hands, let it pass through her fingers like flour, felt its weight, its warmth. She didn't weed, didn't prune, not yet. She simply walked the rows, pausing to press a leaf between her fingers, to watch a ladybug trace its careful path across a tomato stem, to whisper small things to the herbs. "Thank you, I see you, you've done well." Back inside, she brought in a few sprigs of rosemary and laid them on a plate near the sink. Later, she might dry them, or not. Some things are allowed to rest just as they are. The afternoon passed in the kind of rhythm that asks nothing of you. Grace sat in her chair by the window, the one with the cushion that sagged just enough to feel familiar, and opened the small drawer of the side table. Inside were her writing things, a soft pencil, a stack of blank note cards, an envelope or two already addressed in the loose, looping script she still took care to form. She didn't write to anyone in particular that day. She simply wrote about the light on the pear tree near the edge of the orchard, about the sound of the wind tapping against the attic shutter, about the feel of the quilt still warm from the bed when she folded it that morning. There was no story, just the truth of things noticed, which Grace had come to believe was more than enough. Later, she pulled out the button tin. The lid creaked faintly, as it always did, not from age, but from the kind of wear that only comes from being opened gently again and again over many years. She didn't take out much, just one item today, a ribbon, frayed at the edges, pale blue once, now something quieter. It had tied back her hair on her wedding day, or perhaps it had been used for something else, then remembered as part of that day. Memory has a way of softening borders. She held it for a while, not tightly, just enough to feel that it was still real, still here. Then she placed it back, smoothed the contents, and closed the tin with the softest click. The sound echoed faintly in the stillness, like the last note of a hymn before the silence carries it away. Outside, the day began to settle. The light lowered itself across the back field, laying gently over the stones in the fence line, touching the tops of the tall grass with the kind of tenderness reserved for farewells and blessings. Grace stood at the window a while, hands resting lightly on the frame. She watched the crows make their slow way homeward, watched the last petals of the morning glories close in the fading sun. She thought of May's note, still tucked in the button tin, for when you need to remember. She didn't open it again that day, but she thought of it. And in thinking, she did remember, not just May's visit, but all of it. The old days, the quiet ones, the ones with laughter, the ones with loss. She remembered Tom's boots on the porch, the way he used to stir honey into his tea, the sound of the screen door closing behind him as he carried kindling in from the shed. She remembered the smell of rain in the evening, and how it always made her want to read old letters. She remembered how life had been, not perfect, but complete. That evening she lit one lamp in the front room, just one. Its light filled the space not with brightness, but with comfort, like a fire you don't need to sit close to, but are glad to see burning all the same. Grace settled in her rocking chair, pulled the quilt up over her knees, and let her eyes close. She didn't sleep, not yet. She just rested. The chair rocked gently, the house exhaled, and somewhere outside, a bird sang one long, slow note before the day ended. And so the house grew quiet again, but not empty, never truly empty. It held her, and she, in turn, held everything that mattered within her still hands, her watchful heart, and the small tin that waited patiently on the mantel. It had rained again the night before. Not a heavy rain, but the kind that taps on the windows gently, as if asking permission to enter the dreams of those sleeping inside. Grace had woken once, just before dawn, to the sound of droplets tracing their way down the roofline, finding their rhythm along the gutters, then slipping quietly into the soil below. She hadn't stirred from bed, only listened. There's a particular kind of comfort in knowing that the rain is doing its work without needing you to rise for it. That life is continuing, watering, nourishing, softening without your direction. By the time the sky lightened into a soft gray blue, the rain had stopped, and the world outside the farmhouse seemed to hold its breath. She sat at the kitchen table now, a mug of tea warm in her hands, steam curling upward, disappearing into the morning. The light through the window fell in a slanted beam, stretching across the table to the far corner, touching the edge of a wooden box where she kept her writing paper. She didn't plan to write. It simply came to her, as some mornings do, not asking anything in return. She opened the box slowly, as one would open the door to an old room not visited in a while. Inside were envelopes, cards with pressed flowers in the corners, thin paper soft from age. She pulled out a single page, folded once, unmarked. The pencil felt smooth between her fingers, cool, well used, and then she began. Tom, the mornings are quiet now, but you'd like them. The kind of quiet where you don't feel alone, just part of something breathing slower. The fields haven't changed much, though the fence near the sycamore has leaned a little farther this year. I haven't fixed it yet. I tell myself I'm letting it decide its own direction. She paused, let her hand rest over the page. The pencil's tip hovered just above the paper, as if waiting for permission. May was here this past week. You'd be proud of her, the way she moves through the house like she's always belonged, and the way she watches the orchard as if it's telling her things I can't hear anymore. She sat on the old porch step where you used to tie your boots. Without knowing, she placed her hand right where yours used to rest, and she was still there, very still, for a long while. I think some part of you said, "Hello?" Grace smiled gently at the memory. The porch, the girl, the hush of that late afternoon. She asked about your pie crust, the way it always flaked just right. I told her your secret was cold butter and patience, and she said, "So, like you." I didn't know how to answer that. I think she sees us both in the kitchen now. I've been opening the button tin again. Not every day, but often enough. It holds steady, like it always did. There's something kind about small things that stay in place. Outside, a bird trilled once, a wren maybe, or a finch just returned. Grace lifted her eyes, watched the light shift on the table, then returned to the page. The rosemary's come back strong this year. I think it likes the way the rain has been falling. Not too much, not too little. It grows best when you don't expect it to. Like joy, I suppose. Sometimes in the evenings I sit in your old chair by the fire. I don't rock it. That was always your rhythm, not mine. But I sit there, with your book still open to the page you last marked. I haven't turned it. I don't need to. There's comfort in knowing it's waiting. The pencil stilled. Grace let her hand fall to her lap. The letter opened before her like a conversation held in a quiet room. She didn't plan to send it. Not to any address, not even to memory. But the act of writing was a way of reaching, and sometimes that was all that mattered. She folded the letter gently, creased it with her palm, and slipped it into an envelope. No stamp, no name on the front. She walked it across the room, past the fireplace, past the armchair with its cushion slightly flattened from yesterday's sitting, an open drawer beneath the button tin. It was the drawer where she kept the unsent ones, the ones that carried thoughts too soft for mailboxes, the ones she might read again someday, or might not. She placed it atop the others, closed the drawer. Then, slowly, she opened the tin, not to search, not to rearrange, just to let it breathe. Inside, the contents remained unchanged, but somehow more full. She smiled at the tiny muslin bundle May had left behind, the one with the note. She didn't open it. She simply held it for a while, then placed it gently back. That afternoon, Grace sat on the porch with her sewing basket. She didn't sew much anymore, but the basket was still part of her rhythm. Like her tea, like the watering of the porch plants, like the way she turned the cushion in the rocker every week, just so it wore evenly. The wind moved slowly across the field, pressing soft waves into the tall grass. The kind of wind you don't notice at first, only when it's gone. She threaded a needle, tightened a button on her apron, then sat back. The button tin waited inside, the letter in the drawer below it. The house was still, but her hands were not empty, and neither was her heart. Sunday came the way it always had in Grace's world. Quietly, with no rush, no announcement. She didn't keep a calendar hung in the kitchen anymore. There was no need. She knew it was Sunday by the weight of the air, the stillness of the trees, and the far-off sound of the church bell from town, ringing its notes across the folds of pasture and creek bed. It came slowly, a single tone, then another, rising from the valley in the way a memory does, not all at once, but in waves. She had not been to service in years, not for any grand reason. Her knees no longer liked the pews, and the hymns, though beautiful, echoed louder in her mind than they did in the sanctuary. Still, the bell reached her. It always had. It was not a summons anymore, but a greeting, a familiar voice saying, "Here we are again." The house held its own kind of reverence that morning. Even the floorboards seemed softer underfoot, the kettle's whistle quieter, as if aware that today asked for something gentler. Grace opened the cupboard above the sink and reached for a particular teacup, the yellow one. It had a faint chip on the handle and a hairline crack near the base, but it held warmth better than any of the others, and it reminded her of her mother, not because it had been hers, but because of how the sunlight landed on it, the way steam curled from it like breath on a winter morning, the way it never needed to be the nicest cup to be the one most often used. She poured the tea carefully, watching it rise just beneath the rim, and placed the cup gently on the saucer, the one with the faded daisies along the edge. Then she carried it to the table, her slippers brushing the rug in quiet rhythm, and sat down. The bell rang again, a little softer now, as if the valley itself had listened and was offering back its own echo. She didn't read this morning, didn't write, didn't reach for the tin on the mantel. She simply sat. The tea in her yellow cup warmed her hands and sent small curls of steam toward the ceiling. Through the window, the sky was pale, with just enough cloud to keep the sunlight gentle. Beyond the orchard, a deer stood near the edge of the woods, still and tall, as if it, too, had paused to listen to the bell. Grace watched it for a while, then closed her eyes. She thought of her father, the way he used to polish his boots every Saturday evening, even if he wasn't planning to go anywhere on Sunday. He'd hum as he worked, rubbing slow circles into the leather, then holding the boots up to the light as if checking to see whether they still remembered how to shine. She thought of her mother's apron laid across the back of a chair after lunch, the faint flower print near the hip, the loop in the tie where her thumb always rested when she stood to listen, to wait, to love quietly. She thought of how Sundays had once meant church clothes, pot roast, and someone playing the old upright piano in the front room. Not well, but with feeling. And then she thought of the silence, the tea, the deer beyond the orchard fence, the small crack in the handle of her favorite cup. It was enough. Grace sipped slowly. The tea had cooled just enough not to burn. She closed her eyes again and breathed in the quiet. Some mornings didn't ask for anything, not effort, not words, not even memory, just presence, just the steadiness of a breath, the creak of a chair when you lean a little to one side, the faint sound of the bell's last ring disappearing over the hills like a lullaby walking home. She stayed at the table for a while, watching the steam fade, feeling the cup cool in her palms. Then she stood, washed the saucer and cup, dried them with the linen towel that always hung by the stove, and placed them back in the cupboard, not tucked away, but ready. Everything about this Sunday felt like readiness, not for something new, but for more of what already was. Later, she walked out to the garden. The rain had left small puddles between rows, mirrored circles of sky in the dirt. She stepped carefully, gathering a few sprigs of sage and thyme, then bent to pick up a single feather left behind by a mourning dove resting briefly on the fence rail. She turned it in her fingers. Gray, soft, almost weightless. No message, no meaning pressed into it. Just a reminder that something had passed through. She tucked it into her apron pocket and continued her walk, feet slow, eyes lowered, heart full. When she returned to the house, she placed the feather on the windowsill in the front room, next to the smooth stone May had brought from the creek and the jar of clover dried from a spring long gone. Then she stood in front of the button tin. She didn't open it. She didn't need to, but she reached out and rested her hand on the lid just for a moment, as if to say, "We are still here, we are still remembering, and it is enough." Evening came wrapped in fog, not the kind that crept in with drama, but the kind that settled gently, softening the shape of trees, blurring the corners of barns and fence posts, folding the hills into one another like layers of a worn quilt. The sky was pale and low, its weight not heavy but close, as if the clouds had drawn in to rest just above the chimney top and didn't want to leave. Grace had known this kind of night before. It was the kind of evening when even sound traveled slower, when the bark of a faraway dog felt like it came from 100 years ago, and the crunch of leaves underfoot seemed almost embarrassed to disturb the quiet. She lit the lamp in the front window just after the sun dropped behind the orchard, the same lamp she always used, a small one with a yellowed linen shade and a pull chain that clicked in the same gentle way it had for decades. The bulb wasn't very bright, but it gave off a soft circle of warmth that reached the lace curtain, kissed the sill, and spilled a faint glow onto the porch. It was enough. That kind of light always was. She didn't light it for herself, though it pleased her. She lit it because someone someday might see it, might pass on the road or come walking up the path after too long away, or return from some quiet ache, needing nothing but to know that someone had kept a place open. The lamp had become, over time, a language all its own. It said, "You are welcome here." It said, "We're still here, still warm, still waiting." It said, "You haven't been forgotten." She sat by it now, hands resting in her lap, a shawl wrapped over her shoulders like a soft memory. Outside, the fog thickened. The barn disappeared first, then the orchard, then even the gravel path leading to the road was swallowed by the white. Grace didn't mind. She had lived enough years to know that what was hidden wasn't lost, just resting under cover, just waiting for the light to return. She sipped her tea, cool now, but still holding a trace of lemon balm. She'd picked it fresh that morning, not because she needed it, but because some days deserve a small act of grace. The house around her was quiet. The kettle had been emptied. The chair across from hers had its cushion fluffed, as though someone might sit there soon. The door was locked, but not in a way that said no, just not yet. She listened to the tick of the clock above the hearth, steady, faithful, a rhythm that didn't change for company or solitude. She thought about writing, about pulling a letter from the drawer beneath the button tin and answering it, not with ink, but with thought. But she didn't move. The moment didn't ask for action, only attention. The fog pressed gently against the window panes, beating into soft droplets that slid down like slow rain. The lamp's light caught each one as it passed. A brief glimmer, a hush, then gone. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to listen better. She heard the creak of the porch rails shifting in the damp, the wings of a night bird brushing against the eaves, the soft sigh of the wind turning through the trees like pages being read aloud by no one in particular. She opened her eyes again. The lamp was still there, still glowing, still saying what needed to be said. She thought then of all the things she had once waited for. Letters, footsteps, forgiveness. Sometimes what we wait for changes shape. It stops being about the arrival and starts being about the space we make while we wait. She thought of Tom, how he'd always light the porch light before she came home from the market, even in daylight, just in case she was delayed, just in case clouds rolled in. "It's not about the light," he used to say. "It's about the knowing it's on." Grace smiled, let her hand rest lightly on the arm of the chair, and breathed in. The house held that breath with her. So did the lamp. So did the fog. Later, before bed, she rose and moved slowly through the house, turning off switches, drawing curtains, placing her slippers neatly beside the quilted rocker. But she left the lamp on in the window. She always did on nights like this, and when she climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chest, letting the silence wrap around her like another quilt, she pictured the little pool of light outside her home, cutting gently through the mist, not bright, not loud, just there, steady, patient, kind, a lamp in the window for the heart that might be coming home, even if that heart was her own. It started with a drawer that stuck, not from disrepair, but from time, from years of being opened and closed with the same gentle tug, until the wood and the rail had begun to know each other too well to hold on just a little longer. Grace gave it a firmer pull, and the drawer came free with a soft sigh. Inside were bundles of folded fabric, neatly tied with ribbon, some faded to the color of old tea, some still holding a faint scent of cedar and lavender. She had almost forgotten about them. These were not bolts of cloth bought for their color or weight. These were fragments of shirts no longer worn, dresses grown too small or too thin, curtains from the bedroom window in the old house, a tablecloth once used for birthdays. Each piece had been kept not for its usefulness, but for what it remembered. She laid them out on the table one by one, not sorting, just seeing. And as she did, a quiet intention began to form. Not loud, not urgent, but steady. A quilt, not because she needed warmth, but because her hands needed rhythm. She didn't begin right away. She let the fabric sit for a day or two, let the house grow used to the idea as she did, On the third morning, with the fog still hanging low over the field, she took out the scissors. They were heavy, cool in her hand, the kind that made a satisfying click with every close of the blades. She laid the first piece flat on the table, a square of soft blue cotton from one of Tom's work shirts. The elbows had worn thin long before she'd tucked it away. She smoothed it out, held her breath for a second, then began to cut. The sound of scissors on cloth was its own kind of music, a whisper, a snip, a slow exhale of memory. Piece by piece, she worked. She didn't rush, didn't plan each color to match. She let her hands choose what felt right, what spoke quietly from the pile. There was the corner of an apron with strawberries printed on it, the one she wore when May was small, standing on a chair beside her to stir cookie dough with both hands. There was the sleeve of a flannel shirt Tom had worn every autumn when he raked the leaves into great golden piles, then stood back to admire them like a painter before a canvas. There was a corner of a faded nightgown and a square from the cloth they used to drape over the bread as it cooled on Sunday. Each cut was a remembering, each square a small promise that nothing loved was ever wasted. In the late afternoon light, she laid the growing pile of squares beside the window and stepped outside for a moment. The sun had returned in a soft way, spreading light across the porch rail, catching the edges of leaves still damp from morning dew. She stood on the step, holding the scent of cloth and scissors on her fingertips, and watched a bird settle into the pear tree. Its breast puffed, its eye catching the same light that touched the windowsill where her thimble rested. The air was still, not unmoving, but respectful. She returned inside, noticing how the quiet seemed to gather more kindly when there was work in progress. That evening she began to stitch, not on a frame, just with her lap, her needle, and the patience born from having nowhere else to be. The thread moved in and out like breath, each loop pulling a bit of the past into the present. She didn't worry about perfection. Some seams curved, some lines wavered, but every stitch held something: a Sunday morning, a kitchen floor, the hush of a bedtime story. Sometimes, as she stitched, she would pause just to listen, to the clock, to the wind outside, to the sound of her own breathing as it settled into the rhythm of care. She worked like that for days, not all at once, but steadily, in the way seasons arrive, quiet, certain, full of unseen motion. Some mornings she stitched beside the open window, the breeze lifting the edge of the quilt in progress, as if curious. Some evenings she stitched by lamplight, casting soft shadows onto the table and letting the light find each imperfection and bless it. Each time she added a row, the quilt grew heavier in her lap, but lighter in her chest. She didn't think about what the quilt would be for. That wasn't the point. It was not for a guest bed, not for a gift, not even for warmth, though it would surely bring that too. It was for the making, for the slow gathering of pieces, for the memory of hands moving in silence, choosing love again and again in small, steady acts. One morning, May's letter arrived. Not long, just a note. Grandma, I keep the button by my bed. I turn it in my fingers before I sleep, and I think of the orchard, of you, of warm pie. I don't know why that helps me sleep, but it does. Thank you for saving the little things. They turn out to be the biggest. Love, May. Grace read it once, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the button tin. Not between buttons, but under the muslin wrapping the small pearl one she'd given. Then she returned to the quilt, added one more square, a quiet one. gray flannel cut from the hem of her own nightdress, stitched it slowly, pressed it down flat with her hand, and smiled. The quilt was not done, but neither was the remembering, and that too was enough. That day, Grace didn't plan to finish the quilt, but the hours moved like water down a quiet stream, softly, without edges, and before she knew it, the last square had been stitched. It wasn't a grand moment, no ceremony, no sigh of accomplishment, just a single steady breath and the faint tug of thread being knotted at the end. She set her needle aside, rubbed the joints of her fingers, and ran her palm gently across the surface of what she'd made. It was not perfect. Some seams wandered, some corners didn't meet just so. There were places where the thread pulled tighter than it should, but none of that mattered. It lay across her lap like a field at the end of harvest, a little uneven, a little worn, but whole, honest, and full of stories. She left it draped over the arm of the chair for a while. The sunlight had begun to slope down the walls of the house, turning the room golden, then amber, then soft as candlelight. She watched how the colors of the quilt changed with the light, the way the blues deepened, the reds grew warm, the faded yellows near the edge almost glowing like old porch light in summer. She made herself a simple supper, a slice of bread, cheese, a few sliced apples from the basket May had filled weeks earlier. She ate slowly, grateful not just for the food, but for the quiet that wrapped around her like a second skin. And as the evening deepened, she folded the quilt gently over her arms and carried it up the stairs. Her bedroom welcomed her with its familiar hush, the same room she had slept in for nearly 40 years. The same window, same lamp, same creak in the floorboard by the dresser. She stood at the edge of the bed for a moment, looking down at the old blanket folded at the foot. A thin wool one she had used all winter, serviceable, reliable. She set it aside and unfolded the new quilt. It moved differently, heavier in some places, softer in others. She shook it out once, then spread it across the bed. It lay there like a memory being remembered, gentle, sure, without fanfare. Grace changed into her nightdress, brushed her hair slowly at the mirror, then turned down the lamp and climbed beneath the quilt. It was still cool from the room, but not unkind, the kind of cool that promised warmth would come if you simply waited. She lay on her back, eyes on the ceiling, listening. The house had grown even quieter than usual, the way it did on certain nights when the wind didn't stir the trees, when no cars passed on the road, when the only sound was the soft breath of wood settling. She let her hand wander across the quilt, fingertips grazing the stitched seams, the textures of each square, cotton, linen, flannel. Each one had known something different, a meal, a song, a goodbye at the porch, a morning of raspberry picking, a long ago laughter now folded into the dark. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The quilt didn't ask for emotion. It only offered presence. And she, finally, had nothing left to hold on to but sleep. She turned to her side, tucked the corner of the quilt under her chin, and closed her eyes. The scent of old cloth and faint cedar filled the space around her. Not overwhelming, just enough to remind her that she was not alone in this bed. Not really, because memory lays down beside you, quietly. It doesn't take space, but it offers weight. That soft weight of belonging, of time held gently. And Grace, wrapped in the hours of her own stitching, began to drift. Outside, the stars were blurred behind thin clouds, but the moon found its way to the edge of the window and laid a line of silver across the quilt surface, a slanted beam that touched just the corner where a square of red gingham sat them, once part of a picnic cloth, now part of a story stitched into stillness. The wind rose once, just a little, enough to rattle the branches near the side of the house. Then it settled again, like an old dog curling back into its place near the fire. In the deep of the night, when the world tilted softly into its most quiet hours, Grace slept, and the quilt held her, not tightly, not like a grasp, but like an understanding. It didn't guard her from dreams. It didn't erase the ache of years. It didn't pretend that nothing had been lost. But it said, in its own stitched language, "You have carried this. Now, let me carry you." The morning rose so gently, Grace wasn't quite sure when night had ended. There had been no sharp brightness, no sudden warmth on her face, only a slow and silent softening of the dark until the room, once wrapped in moonlight, began to glow from within itself. She stirred beneath the new quilt, her body finding its way back from sleep as if rising from deep water. Slow, without resistance, with the kind of ease that only comes when you feel held. The quilt rested over her like a memory remembered well. Not heavy, but sure. It breathed with her as if it, too, had slept through the quiet night. She didn't rush to sit up, didn't stretch. She simply opened her eyes and listened. There was no sound at first, just stillness. Then a flutter, a soft tap, so faint it could have been imagination. Then again another tap, and then a pause, like a knock waiting politely to be acknowledged. Grace turned her head toward the window, and there, on the sill outside, stood a sparrow, small, round-bodied, feathers puffed against the chill of early light. Its beak tapped once more on the glass, not in demand, not even in curiosity, but in rhythm, as if it had visited before and simply meant to say hello again. She didn't move. She watched as it turned its head this way and that, looking in without expectation. Then it ruffled its wings slightly, pressed its feet closer together, and stilled. The window pane had fogged slightly with warmth from inside, and the bird's tiny form appeared softened behind the light mist. Not quite real, but not quite not. Grace whispered, just barely, "Well, good morning." She stayed in bed a little longer, not wanting to disturb the moment. The bird remained, its eyes bright, its presence small but full of peace. Eventually, the breeze shifted, and with one silent motion, the sparrow lifted from the sill and disappeared into the pale morning. Grace didn't feel its leaving as a loss, only as a return to air, to sky, to whatever tree it had come from and would come from again. She rose slowly, her slippers meeting the floor with a quiet she'd grown to love. Outside the window, the light was becoming clearer, a soft silver stretching through the fog, revealing outlines of tree limbs, fence posts, and the first gold of early leaves turning. Downstairs, the house met her as it always did, with stillness and the faint creak of wood remembering its shape. She filled the kettle, placed it on the stove, and stood at the sink, watching the porch beyond the glass. Dew clung to the banister like beads of morning thought. The rocking chair remained unmoved, but seemed to hold a warmth left behind from all the afternoons before. She made her tea with care, selecting the plain white cup today. No pattern, just smooth, solid clay, the way the morning felt. She didn't turn on the radio, didn't open a book. She sat by the window instead, where the light reached across the table and landed softly on her hands, and then she began to hum, a tune without name, without purpose, something from long ago, not remembered, just felt. Her fingers tapped against the side of the cup like the bird's beak against the glass, a quiet rhythm, a communion. Later that day, she would walk to the orchard. Later, she would write May a short note, telling her about the sparrow and maybe tucking a feather between the folds of the paper if she happened to find one along the fence line. But for now, she stayed with the stillness, with the tea, with the memory of small wings outside her window, the kind of moment no one else might notice, but that stays with you the way scent stays in cloth. Quiet, persistent, loving. And upstairs, folded at the foot of the bed, the new quilt waited, not just as fabric and thread, but as a keeper of breath and sleep, in the presence of tiny things that make the world feel whole again. It was the kind of afternoon that didn't insist on itself, the kind that arrives slowly, wraps itself around the walls of the house like a shawl drawn across old shoulders, and says, "Stay in. There's no need to hurry today." The clouds had gathered in a soft cover overhead, not heavy enough to bring rain, but thick enough to mute the light. It filtered through the kitchen window in long silver-gray beams and fell gently on the wooden floor, the countertop, and the teacup Grace held in both hands. The house was quiet, in that warm, breathing kind of way it always was in late afternoon. Nothing moved, but everything was listening. Grace sat at the table, her shawl drawn loosely around her shoulders, watching the tea cool slowly in her cup. A robin had just hopped across the garden path, its orange chest bright against the fading green of autumn leaves. The sight of it reminded her of a story. Not a big one, just a small round memory tucked away in the folds of a day gone by. And that was enough to make her want to write. She pulled out a sheet of her soft paper, the kind that folded crisply but still took pencil well. Her pencil was already there, lying next to the button tin, as if waiting for the quiet to be deep enough. She smiled to herself and began. "Dear May, today was one of those soft afternoons, the kind you don't plan, but that feel like a gift. I made tea, as always, but this time I let the kettle whistle twice before I took it off the flame. It felt good to let something call out for a moment." She paused, watching the steam curl upward from her cup. It was cooler now, but still fragrant with lemon balm and something faintly earthy. Perhaps the rosemary from her fingers when she clipped a few sprigs earlier that morning. She continued writing. The robin came back. Not the same one as yesterday, I'm sure, but it had the same tilt to its head. It paused right outside the window and looked in at me like it had something to say. I told it I was thinking of you. I don't think it minded. Do you still have the button I gave you? I imagine it near your lamp or tucked inside a small box, waiting to be turned in your hand when the evening gets too loud. I've started adding a few more things to the button tin lately. Not just buttons. A dried sprig of lavender, a pressed leaf from the orchard path, and a small shell I found in a drawer I hadn't opened in years. None of them are useful, but all of them feel like they were waiting for someone to remember them. The room grew a little dimmer. She stood and lit the small oil lamp by the window, its warm circle of light softening the corners of the table, casting long shadows across the folded paper in front of her. She sat again, cupped her hands around her tea, and resumed writing. Do you remember the old red-handled scissors in the sewing basket? The ones with the blade that always stuck a little on the first cut? I used them to finish the quilt. It's done now. I slept under it for the first time 2 nights ago. It held me the way memory does. Not tightly, but completely. There's a square in the middle made from your mother's apron. You probably wouldn't recognize it. It's faded now, almost the color of early milkweed blossoms. But I know it by feel. I always will. She looked up, and through the glass saw that the wind had picked up just a little. The apple tree beyond the garden wall shivered in that way trees do when they're beginning to let go of what they've held all summer. It was a good kind of letting go. Grace returned to the letter. I don't have much else to say today, but I wanted to write anyway. Some days don't need stories. Some days are stories just by happening. A cup of tea, a robin, a drawer that opens more easily than expected. I love you. I hope you feel it on days that are quiet like this one. The lamp is on in the window. It always will be. Love, Grandma. She folded the letter slowly. No rush. The kind of folding done with both care and trust. Trust that it will be opened on the right day, at the right moment, when the heart on the other end is ready to receive it. She tucked it into the cream-colored envelope, addressed in her soft, looping script, and sealed it with the warmth still in her hands. Then she placed it beside the door, ready for the morning's walk to the post box. The light through the window had faded now, but the glow from the lamp remained, golden, steady, like memory itself. She picked up her tea, now lukewarm, and took one last sip. It was still good, still grounding. Outside, the first leaf of the afternoon slipped quietly from its branch and landed on the porch step. Soft, sure, just like the letter. And inside, Grace sat in the hush of the evening, not lonely, but full, not waiting, but ready. The evening settled in with a gentleness that felt like it had been waiting all day to arrive. There were no clouds left in the sky, just a slow deepening of blue, a quiet falling of light across the hills, and the hush of the orchard standing still as if listening to its own breathing. Grace stood at the kitchen sink, hands resting on the rim of the porcelain basin, gazing out at the fading line of trees. The kettle had just cooled, its steam long gone, but the scent of chamomile lingered in the air, earthy, floral, and faintly sweet. She hadn't touched her cup in a while. It sat beside her, still warm, beside a folded napkin and a plate where the last corner of a shortbread cookie had crumbled but never been eaten. Some evenings ask nothing of you except your quiet presence. This was one of them. She turned from the window, moved through the house with slow, practiced steps, and reached for the small lamp near the door. The shade, cream-colored with a trim of blue, had once sat in Tom's workshop. It now lived by the front window, and each night she lit it without fanfare. She pulled the chain, that small, satisfying click, and the bulb came to life. It cast a soft amber glow that spilled onto the floorboards, reached across to the old coat rack, and climbed just enough of the wall to warm the edge of the calendar. Still turned to the same page since May's visit. Grace didn't change it, not because she forgot, but because some things didn't need counting. Some things stayed by staying still. She opened the front door just long enough to feel the air. It was cool, not cold, but touched with the faintest trace of wood smoke and fallen leaves, the kind of air that knew what it meant to wait, to let go, to rest. She reached up and flicked the porch light on. It hummed softly. The familiar old bulb in the rusted fixture above the steps, not bright, not perfect, but dependable. It had lit the way home for decades, for Tom after long walks, for May when she ran out to the swing and back, for the milkman in the years before he stopped delivering. Now it stayed on not for anyone in particular, but for the sake of staying on. for the sake of keeping something open. She stepped onto the porch. The boards beneath her feet gave their usual low creak, and the wicker chair beside the window shifted slightly, as if adjusting itself into the night. The world beyond was quiet, no wind, no passing car, just the breath of a late summer field and the soft rustle of a single maple leaf letting go. She sat, pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and looked out at the darkened orchard. She could no longer see the fence line, but she knew it by heart. Each post, each knot in the wood, and somewhere beyond, the outline of the barn rested quiet in its own long memory. Grace thought of the button tin, still sitting on the mantel, undisturbed tonight. No need to open it. It was full now, not with objects, but with enough. And sometimes enough was the most complete kind of full. She let her gaze rest on the path leading to the road. It disappeared quickly in the dark, but in her mind, she followed it all the way to the gate, past the mailbox, down the bend where the sycamore leaned. She didn't expect footsteps, not tonight, not tomorrow. But the light stayed on anyway. Some things she had come to understand were worth keeping illuminated even when no one was looking. A porch light, a seat at the table, a folded quilt, a letter written just to say hello. They didn't need occasion. They didn't need arrival. They only needed someone to say, "This space is still yours." The stars began to emerge slowly. First one, then another, each blinking into place as if remembering they belonged to the sky. The moon would rise later, but Grace didn't wait for it. She rose from the chair, took one last look at the porch, and stepped back inside. The house was warm, and in the quiet hallway, the soft circle of lamplight still stretched toward the stairwell. She turned once more toward the porch door, glanced back through the glass. The light was still on, and that was all it needed to be. Upstairs, she climbed beneath the quilt, the seams pressed against her palms as she tucked herself in, familiar, uneven, beloved. She closed her eyes and the silence met her gently. In the distance, a night bird sang just once. A leaf brushed the roof, the floorboards settled below, and the porch light, just beyond the front room window, kept shining. For no one, for everyone, for what had been, and for what might still return. As the night deepens and the world grows quieter, I hope this story has wrapped around you like a soft blanket, familiar, warm, and kind. May its gentle rhythm and simple moments stay with you as you drift into a peaceful, untroubled sleep. Wherever you are, whatever weight you carry tonight, know that you are not alone. You are held by memory, by stillness, and by the quiet beauty of small things that remain. If this story brought you comfort, I'd love to hear from you. You're welcome to leave a thought in the comments below. And tell me, what kind of story would you like to hear next time? I'm listening, softly, always,